So welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for our session on securing a just transition amid critical mineral mining. I'm Claire Doyle, and I'm with the Stimson Center, which is a nonpartisan policy think tank focused on foreign policy in Washington, D.C., and I'm with their environmental security program. So one of our work streams is focused on critical minerals, especially in the context of the energy transition. And through our work, we're looking to surface policies, on-the-ground initiatives, and governance models that not only prioritize human rights and environmental protection, but also allow countries and communities to reap concrete benefits from mining activities. So hence the topic of discussion today. As I'm sure a lot of you already know, the last several years have seen a real explosion in demand for critical minerals like copper, cobalt, and lithium. These minerals are key components of a whole range of modern technologies, from renewable energy to battery storage to data centers. We're also seeing defense applications. As the world increasingly turns towards a renewable energy transition and relies on digital technologies, demand for these inputs are surging. So for instance, by 2040, demand for lithium is expected to almost triple. And demand for graphite is expected to soar by 130%. Clean energy is one of the biggest drivers for this demand, especially when it comes to minerals like lithium, cobalt, graphite, and a few others. But the costs of mining these minerals are not distributed equally, nor are the benefits. Global South countries collectively hold as much as 70% of the world's transition minerals. But these countries and communities only capture a really small fraction of their value and only receive a tiny portion of global investments in clean energy technologies. Meanwhile, local communities across the world are bearing the brunt of the costs. Mining for transition minerals has led to human rights violations, displacement, conflict, and pollution that often leaves a long and toxic legacy. So in today's discussion, we'll hear from our experts about what is needed to avoid the extractive dynamics that lead to human rights abuses and environmental harm. And we'll also hear about how mineral projects can drive more inclusive and lasting development outcomes that are aligned with the priorities of producing countries and communities. It's a really broad topic, obviously, and we have a lot of ground to cover, but we have a great panel of speakers and in person and then online, who will help us explore the conversation. And I'm looking forward to all of your engagement too in the last 30 minutes or so during the Q&A portion. So I'm now pleased to introduce our speakers. Our first panelist, Emmanuel Mbula, is the Executive Director of African Natural Resources Watch, or AfriWatch, which is an award-winning NGO headquartered in the DRC that advocates for equity and accountability in natural resource development in Africa. Emmanuel is an expert in business law, human rights, and extractive sector governance in Africa. He has a very long list of accomplishments, including founding the Congo River School and supporting communities in some major human rights and environmental justice cases. Maria Ramos is at Oxfam, where she co-leads the Natural Resource Justice Global Program, which operates across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. She provides strategic leadership on programs at Oxfam in partnership with frontline communities to document the impacts of mining and hold the extractive sector accountable and push for better outcomes. Latoya Abulu is a senior editor at Wanga Bay, covering Indigenous issues, nature-based solutions, and conservation. She's written a lot about environmental issues impacting Indigenous people and local communities, from Ecuador to Nicaragua to South Korea. And she leads journalists who are working on the ground to investigate a range of topics, including critical minerals. Jamie Neen works for Mining Watch Canada. He is the co-lead of their Canada program and is their outreach coordinator. He provides technical support and strategic support to communities who are affected by mining, in addition to working on policy reform. And he also leads Mining Watch Canada's research and advocacy in Africa. And finally, Jesse Ovadia is an associate professor in political science at the University of Windsor. And his work sits at the intersection of African political economy, extractive industries, and development. And he brings an expertise both kind of on the researcher side and as a development practitioner, having collaborated with organizations like the African Development Bank and UNDP. So I'm really thrilled to be joined by all of them today. Before we dive in, just a reminder, we'll have Q&A. So, think of your questions ahead of time, and we'll look forward to hearing from all of you towards the end. So to kick off the conversation, I'm going to turn to Emmanuel. Emmanuel, I know AfriWatch has done a lot of groundbreaking work, not only looking at how to document some of the environmental and social harms that come from mining, but also looking at how mining can work better for communities. Can you give us a little bit of background on AfriWatch to start, and then describe how you're working with frontline communities to bring their voices into decision-making spaces, and also promote development in their terms or on their terms?
Thank you so much for having me to this wonderful conversation on energy transition. So my name is Emmanuel Umpula. I work for both AfriWatch DRC, but also AfriWatch International. And so we are a no-government organization, and our work is to make sure that communities living around those mining companies have a right, accurate information, but also they are prepared in terms of training, so they know their right, but also to hold government and business accountable. That's what we do. We do in terms of main objectives. But what we do, so to reach those objectives, we do education. So we have like Congo River School, where it's a school where we teach communities to know their rights. But also we have programs where we work closely to support communities in terms of a claim of their rights. So we have many programs around many mining companies in Congo, especially in Lualaba province, which is the Congolese capital of cobalt, but also Okatanga, which it's a closer province. So we do also litigation. Litigation, it means when there is a human rights violation or the company didn't respect the law, so we can support litigation. So it depends on the case. It can be pollution. So the case of pollution, it requires a lot of work, because you need specialists like scientists to help you to prove that there is a link between pollutions and the disease. But then you work also with lawyer. We have a Moon Consulting, which is a good law firm. We work with them so closely, so they can support our case to court. But also we do advocacy. Before to do advocacy, we do research. So we produce a lot of evidences. If you go on our website, you will see that there is a lot of information we are producing because you can't advocate toward companies, toward state agencies without evidences. So we need to make sure that we have accurate information. So it takes us enough time, and our team all the time they are on the ground. That to give you a bit of ideas in terms of what are the problems around when we are talking about. So I can give you some figures. In terms of production, copper, Congo is producing like today more than 3 million tons of copper. So it's a lot in terms of production. It's 6 times than what Congo used to, Zaire at that time used to produce. We are producing more than 200,000 tons of copper, of cobalt. of cobalt. So it's a lot of production. Now Congo is producing zinc, and they will start soon to produce lithium. And then you have tin and those minerals related to energy transition. So we have a lot of work, and there is more than, let's say, 25 big mining companies. But if you take all companies, so you have like more than 100 mining companies taking place in DRC.
Great. Thank you, Emmanuel, for sharing some of that context and talking about the important work that AfroWatch is doing. We'll get a little bit more into some of the research that you alluded to. I want to turn next to Maria, because I know you and your team at Oxfam do a lot of research and work on what happens when communities are not engaged meaningfully. And especially now when we're seeing this increasing pressure to fast track mining projects and ask questions later. So first, what issues do you see when communities aren't given the chance to meaningfully engage in negotiations and decisions around mining? And then how is Oxfam kind of pushing back on this pressure and narrative that, we need to move quickly?
Hi all, thank you so much for the invitation to the Stimson Center. Lovely to see you. And Emmanuel, I think you're being humble of the amazing work that AfroWatch is doing in DRC under some pretty intense conditions. I was just in DRC for the first time just a few months ago, and most of us have been working on these issues for a long time, and it was just astounding to me, just the sheer number of massive mine sites, all just next to each other. And this is industrial mining in southern DRC, where the town of Kolwezi is just being like eaten up because mines just keep expanding and expanding. And so, the industry will do an environmental impact assessment of a mine, but not the aggregated cumulative impacts of just all of these multiple mines that are in one location, and also expanding. So sorry, I will answer your question. I just wanted to add on. But interestingly, University of Queensland in Australia did a study just recently where they looked at data over the last 10 years, and they saw that although mineral extraction has increased over the last decade, the number of mines, it hasn't necessarily increased, but it's existing mines that are growing out and going deeper, and that we don't necessarily have the policy instruments to also really engage on this. So bigger tailings dams, bigger land and livelihood impacts, and we're just not really taking this into account. So we are definitely in a commodity boom at the moment, driven, as you said, by geopolitical competition, global demand for minerals. I live in the US, I live in Washington, D.C., and it feels very unprecedented for me, just the flurry of activity around mining. Critical minerals frameworks, MOUs, a dozen new bilateral agreements, plurilateral agreements, Project Vault, which is the stockpiling, mineral stockpiling in the US, and this is driven by the US Export-Import Bank, Forge, which is now the new mineral security partnership, the Quad, the Canada-led G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance, the UN Panel for Critical Energy Mineral Transitions, the World Bank's new metals and minerals strategy. So it's a lot. And then within all this, growing pressure by some in industry and government to fast track mining. And so to bypass, loosen permitting restrictions and bypass needed safeguards. Montevideo recently did a report on the increase of the US Department of Defense or Department of War's grants for critical minerals and state backing of fast tracking approvals without environmental safeguards or meaningful community consultation by companies. And our message as Oxfam to developers, to companies, and particularly to the US government is that if you don't have the social license to operate, which is fundamentally about community consent, which is the ongoing approval by surrounding communities of a project. And a project, on land, can range, for 20 to 30 years. So this is a, long-term, so ongoing consultation. So if you bypass this, it will backfire and lead to costly litigation, protests, work stoppages. And so, if you're the US government or the Canadian government and you want reliable supply chains, this is a risk if you don't have this ongoing social license to operate. So, and there are a number of examples of this. So for example, we work in Mozambique. There's this one graphite mine operated by Syrah that declared force majeure in 2024 because in response to land compensation grievances that hadn't been settled. In 2023, protests broke out across Panama over a copper mine by FQM because of corruption and also consultation and harm. In Guatemala, where Mining Watch Canada also works, there was Constitutional Court suspended a silver mine following protests and lack of community consent, and it has remained closed since 2017. So we're driving this message with companies, investors, financiers, and what we're seeing also is that purchasers, so tech companies, automakers, are increasingly signing direct offtake agreements to ensure that they have materials. That they have this material that they need for their products. But also they don't necessarily want to be associated with labor or human rights violations. And so they're increasingly putting pressure on the miners to also clean up their supply chains. And then finally, to the other question, so Oxfam is a global development organization. We've been working on oil, gas, and mining issues for 20 plus years, and then on these issues across some 24 countries, Latin America, Africa, I've been in Asia. And we're, providing political accompaniment, technical accompaniment to communities at the front lines of extraction. So to level the playing field, really. So we see this as issues of inequality through the lens of inequality and the lens of power. Where, supporting communities in terms of leveling the playing field about information of project impacts and potential benefits. For example, at the moment, I'm reviewing an environmental impact assessment of an infrastructure project in Zambia, holding companies accountable for harm, like challenging Glencore's copper mines in Peru with the OECD and other litigation, to ensure that people participate in decision makings around mining revenues. So there's a lot of money that is not just flowing to national governments, but particularly to local governments, where the relationship between the state and the citizens are the closest. So we're doing this across West Africa, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and others. And then lastly, we also provide material and political support to human rights defenders. So based on research from Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Global Witness, and other organizations, mining is the most dangerous sector for environmental and human rights defenders. So pushing this and also operating very much in globally in an environment where there's just shrinking civic space. And so providing material support to defenders if, say, they need to leave the country, or they need, legal support to defend themselves against, lawsuits. And also pushing this with companies as well to defend the chemical scent and the importance of this.
Great. Okay, yeah, great. Thank you, Maria. I think it's helpful also to get that initial context of what this pressure is, how it's manifesting in places like Washington, D.C. and the policies that are coming out. Latoya, you've worked on investigations on critical mineral mining, and you've led journalists who are doing some of this reporting on the ground. Can you share some stories or insights at the intersection of mining, environment, and human rights? And what stands out from your reporting? Where have things gone well? Or are there stories where there's more positive outcomes or accountability at least?
Of course. Hi, everyone. So yes, there are many investigations on the topic that we've done globally. There are several that stand out in different parts of the world. I'll kind of take you through them, and they highlight certain themes, interesting themes in each region. So our most recent investigation, like you just mentioned, was showing how the U.S. Department of Defense is spending more and more throughout the years on critical mineral projects for military purposes. So what we found was that in the last 5 years, there was about $550 million that was put into these critical mineral projects. These were in the US and in Canada, and that's up from 31 million in the previous 5-year period. This was mostly in lithium and neodymium boron. Sorry, I'm not very good with the names, but lithium is used across weapons, and neodymium is used really in Tomahawk missiles, smart bombs. So what we're really seeing is it helps dispel this kind of narrative that critical minerals are only used for renewable technologies. We're really seeing a surge for military purposes. And so when it comes to human rights issues and indigenous peoples, among these projects that we were looking at that the Department of Defense was investing in, there were some allegations of human rights violations when it comes to consultation and obtaining consent. And there are 2 federal programs that they were blaming for this. One is the FAST-41 federal program, which helps make more efficient, let's say, the permitting process for these mining projects. And what communities are saying is that it's speeding up the process way too much, and they're not being properly involved in consultation processes. The other program, or I should say it's a law, is the DPA, which is the Defense Production Act, which is a law that allows the president to accelerate and to speed up reserves and supply chains for these minerals. And so the communities that we spoke to were, there were Inupiaq indigenous communities in Alaska. We were also speaking with indigenous communities in Nevada, and also communities in Canada as well who are impacted by this. And if we move now to the DRC, which Emmanuel is also highlighting, there's 2 investigations that really stand out. One of them is showing how conflict creates an atmosphere of impunity for mining companies to operate. So an investigation I worked on showed how Alpha Mine, which is a Canadian and South African-owned mining company, renewed its permits without consulting and obtaining the consent of the indigenous communities who were impacted. So the mining permit was literally on their land. And in the environmental impact assessments, they were not mentioned at all. And in the maps, they were kind of wiped off the map. So they didn't exist in the company's maps. And when we were speaking with the communities, what they were saying was that the governor of North Kivu was not looking at civil claims at the moment. So all of their complaints were not being taken into account because there was armed conflict. And so that all the priorities was put on to the war at the moment. And in another region of the DRC that we did a key investigation, looked at the impact mining had on human health. So what we did was that we went into the DRC's copper cobalt belt in the south, in Walaba province, and we visited several communities in which they were complaining about unexplained deaths or even miscarriages that were on the rise, lung disease. People had skin infections, their crops were not growing. And they were saying, due to contamination from mines that were nearby. So when we visited these communities, what we found was that there was impunity. And we also found that local authorities were not really following up on all these issues. And one of the companies that was involved was the Tenge Fungurume mine, which is one of the biggest cobalt and copper mines of the world. And later an investigation was actually done by the EIA into this mine, and that led to an investigation into the mining company itself. And if we go to the Amazon, a recent investigation that we did showed how a surge in critical mineral mining is impacting Amazon rivers at the moment. So what we found was that since 1969, there was 676 mining permits in this particular region of Brazil. But in the last 5 years, about a quarter of these permits came up. So that's showing how really there's been a big push for mining permits, and a lot of them are already on indigenous lands or on agrarian reform settlements. And so there are issues in one of the indigenous territories because they're complaining that the company has polluted a river, and a study has shown that 98% of the people who are tested are contaminated with heavy metals. And then also other farmers who have complaints against another Brazilian mining company called Brazil. And they're also saying that they are responsible for large fish kills. I hope that I have enough time if I just run through the different regions. And an investigation we did last year in Myanmar showed something that was very interesting in terms of the hidden costs of unregulated mining for critical minerals. So Myanmar is marred in a civil war at the moment, and the surge in mining happened since the coup d'etat in 2021. It has led to unregulated mining in the Kachin state, which is on the border with China. And when I was speaking with locals and local CSOs in that area, they were highlighting some really interesting social dynamics that a lot of media was not capturing. And one of them was that in mining areas, it's very easy to get access to drugs. And there was a surge in addiction, which is causing family and marital problems in the area. Another social dynamic that's happening was a surge of inequality. So people who had or maintained connections with local authorities in the mines were benefiting economically, socially, while other people who are working in the mines were not. They didn't really see a change in their living standards. And finally, I think it's really important, I guess, because I also work on the Indigenous News Desk, is to highlight the impact of critical mineral mining on uncontacted Indigenous people. So people who are in voluntary isolation are very vulnerable. The legal apparatus and international apparatus is kind of weak when it comes to their protection. One of the stories we were working on was focused in Indonesia with the Ohanga Mangawa people. There's part of the people who are contacted and part of the people who remain uncontacted. And in that area, the Halmahera island of Indonesia, there's a huge nickel boom, and it's impacting the forest in which the isolated, the uncontacted Ohangana people rely on. And so when we were speaking with their contacted brothers, they were saying how hungry and how much in distress they were because they couldn't have access to lands for hunting and gathering. These are a lot of negative stories and negative investigations, I would say. It is very difficult and has been difficult for us to highlight, let's say, what is going well. But there is one story that does come to mind, and it's about the Goro mine in New Caledonia. This mine has been marred in a lot of issues with acid leaks going into coral reefs and impacting waters in which the Indigenous Kanak people depend on. However, in 2022, Pony Resources purchased that mine, and Pony Resources is a locally led consortium. Half the shareholders are local Indigenous peoples. And what they're hoping to do is to be watchdogs to this mine. And for context, this mine is the only mine in the Pacific that supplies Tesla. So they're hoping to change the course of what the Goro mine has done. We haven't done follow-ups on that yet, but that's kind of like the good-ish story. There have been impacts from our reporting that we've seen that have led to policy changes and have helped communities, but I think we can talk about that later.
Thank you so much, LaToya. I think it's very sobering to hear a lot of these stories, and obviously telling that it's hard to find or cover stories of where things are going better. I want to turn to Jamie now because I think we're based here in Canada right now. We're sitting on the unceded territories of the Algonquin people. We heard mention this morning about the intersection of Indigenous people and communities and mining. And yet, I think conversations that are happening in the global north about mining sometimes focus more on global south contexts, even though countries like the US and Canada have mining challenges at home. So following this thread of local communities from Emmanuel and Maria and LaToya so far, what are some of the kind of salient insights you have from your work protecting the rights of Indigenous and local communities in Canada and ensuring that they have a say in mining decisions here?
Thanks, Claire. And thanks to fellow panelists and all of you. I also want to say hello to Emmanuel and also recognize something from Myanmar, from Kachin, who spoke earlier this morning in another panel. about many of the same issues that we're talking about here. I mean, the Canadian context is complex as a federation with a lot of jurisdictional issues, and a complex history of treaty and non-treaty relationships with Indigenous peoples. There are entire books written about this, so I'll try and be concise. But I think the important thing to start with is a recognition of mining as an expression of colonial power, because no people or place has been left better off from mining. Therefore, mining exists where people are unable to act against it for whatever reason, because the benefits flow out. And even on, let's say, a national or subnational scale where there is prosperity generated from mining, it is not for the mining district, who at best can capture some of that, and typically not very much, because the benefit flows to the investors. And in fact, even at the national or subnational level, if we start including the externalized environmental and health costs of mining activity, the balance quickly shifts, and we find that even over the short to medium term, that those liabilities outweigh the benefits. Again, there may be a net benefit, but it is not there. It is in Barbados. It's in Toronto. It's not in the place where the mining takes place. The Golden Towers are on Bay Street. They're not in Timmins or Sudbury. So that is to say that, and with Canada's history, where we're looking at mining taking place in Indigenous territories, and with all of that sort of legal and jurisdictional complexity, is where Indigenous peoples are struggling to recover some degree of territorial control. And we have a variety of legal standards and mechanisms, starting with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, going through the treaties, going through the Constitution Act of 1982 and Section 35, guaranteeing, recognizing and guaranteeing Aboriginal rights, and through to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted by Canada reluctantly and implemented in a limited and bizarre fashion into law federally and in British Columbia. But what those things say is that there is at least a pro forma recognition of the existence of Indigenous peoples as self-governing entities. Again, with differing degrees of territorial control across the country, depending on whether the Supreme Court has recognized them as independent tribes. In the Chilcotin case, the only one that we have so far, following on a more limited expression in Haida, through comprehensive claims agreements, north of 60 in northern Quebec and Labrador, and through different treaty interpretations and expressions. So what we have is people struggling from a position of, in some cases, several centuries of dispossession, to recover some of their own legal orders and governance structures and control over the territory, including mining development, and to turn that into agreements with governments and industry actors about how that industry will install itself if it is allowed to do so. So whether mining is allowed to proceed is sort of the first and most important question. It's kind of the only point where people actually have control over that system. Even in the New Caledonia example, the Kanak people opposed the Goro mine strenuously for a long time. And as a French colony, they've eventually found themselves unable to stop it. The indigenous Kanaks were forced to go to Paris to plead their case and have it rejected. And the ability of indigenous peoples in Canada to prevent mining is also limited. There's a case actually going to the Supreme Court now from British Columbia about the British Columbia Mineral Tenure Act, which allows, as almost every other part of the country does, mining claims to be staked on Indigenous territory without consent, in many cases without even notification. And in BC until 2 years ago, it was also without notification, much less consent. And which the courts have so far found, at least to the federal court of appeal, found that this was not compliant with the UN Declaration and the standards that Canada and BC have set for themselves. But as I say, that is a recent iteration of a struggle that's happened in a number of territories over the last 18 years or so, and still have not been recognized in policy federally, provincially, territorially as actually the law of the land, and allowing people to decide according to their own governance and their own land use planning processes and so on, where and whether mining should take place. So, and even the comprehensive claims agreements in Nunavut, for example, still allow this same staking system to take place, and allow, therefore, legal and commercial interests in the land to be created ahead of any actual negotiation about the conditions of mining. And that's sort of the crux of it, because then, you have communities, as I said, in many cases, suffering extreme deprivation, in a position of having to say no to an industry that's offering them some income and some jobs and some contracting opportunities and so on, when they're struggling with finding adequate housing, education, healthcare, even clean water for their own citizens. And so the Chiefs of Ontario put forward, and following the province's last round of fast tracking the Ontario Bill 5 a little over a year ago, that and I think this was echoed by the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, that a nation building project would be actually providing adequate housing and clean drinking water to those communities, and then we can talk about mining. But that's not how it proceeds, and I think that is reflected on a global scale, where communities are trying to impose some restrictions and conditions on the advance of mining, but without those, without the ability to actually set the rules. So yeah, there are a number of mechanisms that we have in play, but those are a longer discussion.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Jamie. I think it's also, what you mentioned at the beginning about the distinction between the kind of value or benefits of mining flowing to at the national level versus really towards a community level, where producing communities can access some of the value. I think we'll dwell on that a little bit more later. Jesse, I want to turn to you now, zooming out to this kind of national level. A lot of the work that you've done has looked at resource-driven development, and thinking, for instance, about how countries that have relied on oil and gas have struggled to translate that into sustainable development outcomes. What lessons can producing countries and communities now in this kind of critical mineral boom, what lessons can they draw from that experience, and where are there kind of differences in how mineral based development differs from, let's say, oil and gas based development?
And thanks, Claire, and thanks to the Stimson Center for helping organize this, and to all of you for coming. a lot of my research has been on oil and gas producing countries, especially in Africa. And obviously the history, oil and gas is notorious, infamous for producing a lot of negative outcomes, as is mining. And I did a lot of my research focused on at least the possibilities, the potential for developmental outcomes nationally and in communities hosting extraction. And I was doing this research for my PhD in 2010, 2013, sort of at the end of a long commodity boom, right? And I had this idea, it hadn't ended yet, so I had this idea that there was at least a possibility for these countries to leverage the strategic value and the importance of oil as a commodity in order to press for more developmental outcomes. That was the idea of my research. I wrote a book called The Petro-Developmental State in Africa, and that was the focus of that book. And I think in the current moment with critical minerals, a lot of the same conditions that I was interested in and that I was writing about related to oil and gas are present with regard to critical minerals, and in terms of their strategic value, in terms of the idea that the global economy requires these minerals, that the global militaries rely on these minerals. Any kind of extractive industry involves resource extraction from the ground in a specific location, right? It's not like a factory that you can pick up and move somewhere else. So governments have a certain amount of leverage, although it varies case to case, to say, you need to put in place a set of policies. You call them they can call this a resource nationalist idea. Put in place a set of policies that will provide some amount of benefit, probably to the state in most cases, not so much to the community. And unfortunately, the challenge is trying to avoid that benefit only going to certain powerful people, certain elites, right? But I at least held out the hope that this was possible. And it turned out it wasn't possible. James already laughing at me. Yeah, that you could have and what I focused on was local content policies and industrial policy more broadly, and the possibility of leveraging, in my case, oil and gas, or leveraging in the current moment critical minerals to try and move up the value chain from simply being a country that exports raw materials and imports finished goods to have more industrialization and economic diversification, even anchored in resource extraction. And that's a major policy plank of a lot of the countries that are interested in extracting critical minerals, DRC and Zambia included, trying to ensure that more of the beneficiation activities, the smelting of the copper and all the different activities that occur after you extract the mineral, more of them are done in country, right? And then moving along and saying, well, could we manufacture batteries in DRC Zambia? Could we manufacture electric vehicles, right? And that's only the forward linkages. I was actually more interested in the backward linkages, local content policies that Angola and Nigeria put in place in the 2000s were focused on different services that extractive companies require in order to extract the resources. And my idea was that those are potentially at least more developmental because it's a variety of services that have other non-oil applications, right? Drilling can be used to drill water wells, right? And companies need all kinds of services that you can then try and expand in the country that we're talking about. And that's the kind of developmental strategy using industrial policy, using state protectionism, using some import substitution that every country that has industrialized successfully has used, right? Since Britain, in the first industrialized country, every other country, including Canada, has used protectionism in order to industrialize. So it's a bit far-fetched in some respects, but it's also the only possible way you could imagine development taking place. And ironically, it's an avenue for development that the development industry, that the World Bank and the IMF closed down for a long time to developing countries, right? The idea of the Washington Consensus was that you have to open up your markets for private investment. You have to, the state doesn't have any role in development. And any country that wanted to do what I was talking about would face a lot of pushback. But having oil and gas being valuable, having a critical mineral, gives you some ability to say, we want these policies, right? And we're seeing that not only with local content focusing on backward linkages, but export bans in Indonesia and in DRC in order to force a more beneficiation at the local level. And I think there's still some potential in these policies, not at the community level, but at the national level to move towards industrialization and to diversify away from extraction, because extraction is a very dirty industry and has a lot of negative impacts, human rights impacts, gendered impacts, and so on. And I guess what I would end by saying is that there's certainly a lot of challenges in trying to pursue this kind of path, but we got to at least articulate a vision of what we would like to see happen. It's part of having wanting a company to have a social license to operate is there needs to be a vision of why taking out these minerals out of the ground could be beneficial and could lead to more developmental outcomes. So maybe we'll talk more about that later on.
Yeah, I have one quick follow-up, actually. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the role of employment or employment opportunities. I know that there's concerns around, the life cycle of a mine and what happens after, and you talked a little bit about economic diversification. One of the things people talk about sometimes is employment opportunities, but to what extent do you see that playing out? How can employment maybe play a role?
Yeah, I mean, the direct employment from oil and gas is extremely limited. From mining, it can be larger, then there can be involvement of artisanal miners and other areas, although that's problematic. But there are also indirect employment opportunities. And that's what I think local content policies to increase beneficiation are more about the indirect benefit, the benefit outside of the direct extraction. And I think there's a great deal of potential in that. In oil and gas, these are companies that are investing on a single project, billions, tens of billions, sometimes if it's offshore, in a single project. And they're spending that money on goods and services. And a lot of those employ a lot of people, and their spillover impacts from that. And that's not even talking about all the forward linkages and the products that are produced and could more than be produced in country. So I think there is significant employment potential, but not directly in the extraction.
Okay, that's helpful, yeah. Thank you. Emmanuel, I want to turn back to you now. We've talked about kind of what's happening at the local community context and now zoomed out to national context. And I know that AfriWatch has done a lot of work at this national level. And you've helped revise Congolese mining standards or regulations and done extensive analysis on kind of resource for infrastructure models. I think AfriWatch recently had research published on this. So based on your work at this national level, can you share what some lessons are for resource-rich countries, how they can orient their domestic policies, and maybe partnership models too, to reap some of the benefits of mining? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, yeah, of course, we've just a couple of months to release the report on um, uh, infrastructures versus resources, which is a model promoted by China in most of the case. And we didn't just do in DRC, so we do in 5 countries, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, Guinea, um, DRC, and there is another country, so it's in 5 countries, and we found that this model usually the Chinese or China is usually present this model like the win-win model, and uh, we are in the context where African countries they need infrastructures and China need resources. So we are in this context. So we try to compare and see how this model is applicable in each countries, and we found that there were differences. It depends on where. And you see that, for instance, in DRC, this model didn't work. It was not a win-win contract. There is a lot of reasons. One of the reasons I can I share with you, I mean, you see that China has a strategy when they present that they are going. Normally, when you sign that kind of contract, it means before starting producing minerals, you need to build those infrastructures. So in the practice, it doesn't work like that. So in the case of DRC, they've been exploiting minerals, and up to now, they never deliver those infrastructures. So it means that Congo is financing its own infrastructures instead of. So this, the consequence of this is the Congolese debt is rising in terms of because we are paying for something we didn't get. That one reason, one reason. The other one is implementation. So we found that in the case of the DRC, the implementation was a problem. So on the Congolese side, but mostly on the Chinese side. So the implementation was not good. And then we found that in this model, on the business mining model, you will find that Chinese they are controlling the whole system, the company. So they control everything. So and then they share more information with Congolese authorities. So if you try to see how much they've been Congolese they've been getting back in terms of investments, you don't find those information. Or if you find them, they are not actual information. And yeah, so we try also to see in Zambia. We found that in Zambia, of course, there's similarity, but also the other problem is pollution. You see that regulation, Chinese companies, they don't follow the mining code, for instance, how to protect the environment, how to relocate communities living around them in case where they need to do that. And then you see, if you try to compare to Zambia, you find that in Zambia, Zambia, the infrastructure is there. They deliver infrastructures. And then the question is, why in Zambia they did better than in Congo? So, of course, there's other problems, but then you try to ask yourself, and you find that where state doesn't play a key role to control what they are doing, then we find that they are not delivering a good work. And so, is that a good model to follow? My answer will be I'm not sure if it's a good model, but at the beginning, I was thinking that was a good model. But if you the country need to have that kind of contract, they need to make sure they have the system which can control, which can make sure that Chinese they are implementing what the commitment they took in the contract. And so I can see that in the case of DRC, they were, I mean, they were just taking advantage to that situation, and that's why they didn't deliver those infrastructures. So now you have a lot of problems. And I remember before this report, we published another report where we were asking, they were the audit asking for Congo to revise this contract. So it should move from because it has its own law, the contract itself, so we don't apply the Congolese mining code. So we are asking for Congolese government to cancel this contract and to apply to this contract the Congolese mining code. So this could be profitable for DRC because of Chinese, they didn't deliver infrastructures we need. And also the other thing, the last thing you can see, you will see that the infrastructure themselves, they are not of good quality. So they are poor. And if you go around, you see where those infrastructure, some of them they were built, you find that they are poor, they are not the infrastructure of good quality, and that means yeah, so it's another problem. The other problem with that, and then I can end there, I can end at that, they charge more. So it means we have like a road of 5 kilometers. They can charge like $40 million. So how come a road of 5 kilometers can be charged? So yeah, that's another problem. And then we found that they said because the part of infrastructures was 3 billions, from 2007 up to 2021, they didn't even reach 1 billion in terms of infrastructures investment. So how come you are producing, they are making a lot of money, at the same time Congo didn't get those infrastructure? And Congo initiated, I will end there, Congo initiated the revision, but this revision didn't end properly because the lack of transparency, corruption, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for sharing about some of that and unpacking for us how these resource for infrastructure models are playing out in different countries, and how they might be able to play out better. Okay, I think we're coming towards the end of, I think, the panel portion, and I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but I have a couple more questions. So if we can quickly touch on gender, as we haven't really talked about gender yet. I know, Maria, you and Oxfam have done a lot of work on how the harms of mining can disproportionately fall on women. And so I want to ask you, kind of from your perspective, how do you see gender equitable mining? And what are ways that mining can not only not further undermine women's rights, but actually provide opportunities for women?
We're tight on time, but these are, I mean, this whole like resource-backed infrastructure and resource-backed loans, there's a lot to unpack. Industrialization policy, there's a lot to unpack. I wish we had more. Yes, okay, so gender. So the impacts of extractives of mining in particular fall disproportionately on women. And this is because of social norms across many jurisdictions, because of the way that land is held in many jurisdictions, and mining is just land intensive. And then in the absence of women's agency and consultation and decision-making, this can translate to a number of human rights infringements. So for example, when land is expropriated for mining projects, women's livelihood and food security are at jeopardy. The risks of HIV, AIDS, other STIs because of the influx of workers to a project. Violence against women, there's also a rise in violence against women because of changes, more socioeconomic pressures and changes in the family structure, and also because of changes to a cash economy. vital resources like water, wood, cooking become more scarce. And then, water becomes polluted, and then women and girls' unpaid care work, which is a huge issue, can increase dramatically. So what does gender equitable mining imply? So meaningful consultation of women, intersectional gender impact assessments. And what I mean by that is, say you're Indigenous and you're a woman, or you're in a particular ethnic group and you're a woman. What do these mean in the aggregate? Land for land compensation. So often cash is given to compensate communities. That cash is often given to the man. That cash is spent, and then you're out of luck, right? And then compensation that doesn't just focus on the head of the household, which is often a man, but others. Protection of women's human rights defenders, and again, because mining is such a risky industry, and women are at different levels of risk. Earmarking public resources and mining revenues for services that promote gender equality. Local procurement contracts, as you mentioned, that really target women service providers. So the mining industry needs a lot of services in terms of food or cleaning services, et cetera. So prioritizing that. Resourcing health services for women as well. So not just, these are often impacts that are not taken into account, but increasing of public services for women from public revenue. So that's just, I know we're out of time, but that's just a handful.
Yeah, thank you. And we can also dig deeper into some of this in the Q&A. LaToya, I think I'll end with you. Yeah, with one quick question on connecting the dots between mining and some other sectors. I know a lot of the work that you've done has looked at nature-based solutions, conservation, forests. Can you share some of the lessons from some of those other areas that you worked on for mining?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the key lessons is how everything is connected when I'm working on the stories on Indigenous peoples. And when I mean connected, I mean between nature and people on the front lines, often Indigenous peoples and local communities. I just came back from Peru's Amazon, where I was working in a village, and I was working on an agroforestry project. And agroforestry is a kind of sustainable farming solution where they're mixing agricultural crops with forests. And it's one of the most fascinating aspects of agroforestry, especially in the Amazon, is that you'll go on this piece of land and you're technically in a farm, but it looks like a chaotic forest. But there is an entire system at play, and this land that I was on, it was sustaining an entire multi-generational family. And when you go into this land, like there's so many endemic tropical birds that are on the farm, that are relying on the trees, on the crops on the farm. And a lot of these endemic tropical birds, they help in seed dispersal. So the landowners depend on the birds to, excrete all around the place. And this helps grow some types of fruit trees. And the thing is that these particular endemic birds, and researchers come to this land to even to research on these birds. If the intact forests surrounding these agroforestry projects did not exist, you wouldn't have these birds coming to these agroforestry lands to help the communities. So you really see how everything is very connected, and the impacts that mining could have, like losing forests, is not simply like losing some trees near a land. You're taking a pin out of an entire food system that communities rely on. So that's one of the key lessons that we're reminded time and time again, the connection that people have between land, water, soil. It's so much more than, abstract commodities that some industry players can talk about. Like there are places where people are rooted to the land. Everyday survival depends on these areas and their identities too. So I think that's one of the key lessons from our other reporting that we applied to the mining.
That's great. That's a great note to end kind of the initial discussion. And I know that there's plenty more that we could touch on. So I hope that we can do that in the Q&A and maybe in the last couple of minutes too, to give you guys a chance to wrap up any thoughts. Okay, I think let's turn to Q&A.